Alright, so when you're making some kind of delicious something and you look around your house and you realize that you really don't have any ingredients, you don't have any pre-made pie fillings or any pre-made pie dough, what do? Honestly, for me, the answer is to literally whip out the bag of flour, the butter, and the salt and the water and just make my own pie dough. This is something that I've done before when I literally had nothing sweet to eat and I said, you know what? I've got raw apples, just whole apples. I've got flour and I've got butter. I've got plenty of water in my faucet and I have salt on hand. So why don't I just whip up a quick apple pie and then have apple pie? When you know how to cook and you know how to bake, this is the kind of just like hard alchemy you can do in your kitchen with otherwise completely inconspicuous ingredients. And it really doesn't take that much more time. So, let me show you how this goes. By the way, if you want to see these videos 2 weeks earlier, consider subscribing to my Patreon, where you not only get all these videos, but also recipe cards, specific deity profiles, and lots of other interesting things to look at. Video tiers start at $10 a month, so definitely consider checking it out.
Alright, so here we are in the kitchen to make a fresh batch of homemade pie crust. And I feel like homemade pie crust is one of those things that is just unnecessarily intimidating, right? A lot of people might opt to instead just go to the store and buy the classic little, name brand pie crust, whether it's Pillsbury, whether it's just a Walmart brand. You might just want to grab these instead, and honestly, I get you. But if you want something pie-like and you don't want to go to the store just for one box of pie crust, that's alright, because pie crust just takes 4 ingredients. And there's a lot to be said when it comes to pie crust about like, oh, the flakiness, cold butter, this and that, can't use your hands, up and down, and to all that I say, yeah, whatever. The pie crust is still perfectly serviceable even if you knead it with your hands and get it a little bit warm. So here I'm taking about 315-ish grams of flour and I'm taking 2 full sticks of butter. And this is the part that, for traditional pie crust, you definitely don't want to just like give up on keeping the butter cold altogether and just start mixing it with your hands right away, right? Because you don't want the batter to become soup. That's the big thing. The reason we're keeping the butter in chunks for the first little while is because that helps create these layers of flakiness that pie crust is so well known for. So take all your butter, get it soft enough that you can easily cut it, right? Like it shouldn't be rock hard, but then you're just gonna kind of cut it into little chunks and press them all into the flour with a couple forks. If you have a hand or a stand mixer or something, this might be a little bit easier, but for the most part, 2 forks is the way to go because those forks aren't going to get all the butter all melted all over your hands. Eventually, they'll start crumbling into the flour and hydrating the flour just a little bit, and it's at that point that you want to start adding some water, as well as salt if you haven't added salt already. Remember to put a good teaspoon of salt. As you saw before, I put some salted butter in here, so I didn't add any extra salt. That is a mistake. You do need a good deal of salt, like a good teaspoon, because this recipe makes 2 solid pie crusts. So 1 for the bottom, 1 for the top. That's what this one recipe makes. But at this point, I am using my hands because it's at the point where the forks are no longer cutting it. And now, right, we don't want just like some crumbly bumbly dough. We want something that has gluten, so it stretches. So when we roll it out, it doesn't just fall apart in our hands. That's why we have to actually get in there and knead it for a good while. And I am kneading it for a good while. Not so long that all the butter melts, but long enough that it just starts to soften up and hydrate that flour further. So here's our sticky little doughboy that we are going to wrap in a nice plastic blanket, and then we're going to let him sleep in the fridge for a good at least 2 hours. That makes it so that all the butter we softened a little bit by kneading it firms up again, and we have a solid pie crust to work with. And now here's the other thing I learned while I was making pie dough again. Really, you can almost never roll it out too thin. So as you go making a mess of your table with all the flour, you can see that I'm not really rolling it super thin right off the bat, because this doesn't look like a lot of pie dough, but it is. It absolutely is. And I just, for some reason, never have the patience to get it as thin as it needs to be. So don't be like me. You know how thin those pie crusts are when you get them in the package. Try to get it that thin. And here I'm actually cutting out some ghost shapes, because while I was making this pie crust, I also decided to use some of this for another recipe I was making, which was some spooky spanakopita, a nice Greek-style spinach pie. The ghosts on top made for a cute little decoration, and they were very flaky and delicious. It's also just fun. It's a fun way to make any meat pies or any other kind of pies just a little bit more festive for the October season. But once again, make sure you roll out your pie crust thin enough, because as you're about to see, I did not do that, and I had a lot of overhang for a very thick crust. And then I made the problem even worse by trying to do that pretty crimping thing that you always see people do on their pie recipes, and while it looked pretty before, I blind baked it without any beans, so it all fell down. And then I was going to make a pumpkin pie because I had made some really good pumpkin puree, and I had some like leftover pumpkin just kind of waiting around. Pumpkin curry is a great way to use any giant cans of pumpkin, but you know, some haphazard measuring of spices and just kind of following the recipe barely, I have this giant bowl of pumpkin soup that ended up being way too much for the pie pan. So we're already 0 for 2 on this pie. We have a crust that is too thick, and we have far too much pumpkin, but that did not stop me from sinking my ghost into it and trying to put it in the oven. And at first pass, when I pulled it out the first time, I mean, it looked good, right? It looked like a pie that reasonably would be delicious. The ghosts on top were nice and golden, everything was great, but the inside was just too thick, and I realized as I put it back in that it had not baked, so I tried to bake it longer and only ended up burning a good bit. So really be careful with how thick your pie crust is. While my spanakopita was all nice, the pumpkin pie, not so much.
Obviously, are there some things to watch out for? Yes, you definitely want to, again, make sure that your pie crust is not too thick, and you want to make sure that you're salting it enough, but when you have the ability and the understanding and the reasoning to make your own pie dough, you can make some good pie dough, right? You can make some really good pie dough, and therefore you can make some really good on-the-fly just pies. If you still have some pumpkin puree left over, if you have, I don't know, apples that you gotta use up, congratulations. You can just whip something up on the fly now. Hell, even if you wanted to make dinner, right? Make meat pies, make chicken pot pie. This works for that too. And all you gotta do is just mix up some stuff and stick it in the fridge. So I hope this is helpful for you guys, and I'll see you for another lesson next week. See ya!